Thank you all for coming. This is awesome. We weren't quite sure how many people would come to a roundtable discussion. We don't get to do this as often as we should, but it's a good way to be able to get this started. So tonight and this entire week is extremely special for the SUNY Fredonia School of Music. This is the first of what is hopefully quite a number of residencies that we'll be having as part of support that we were getting through the Sorel organization. For those of you who don't know, Claudette Sorel was one of our piano professors for quite a few years, and the organization that was put together in her honor supports a number of different projects, including the piano competition that we've been doing for the last 7 years. And this year we get to start a second project, which is having a world-famous woman composer come to Fredonia, not once but twice, because she'll be back in February. And each time she's here, and they are here when we bring in our next residencies, in addition to concerts, which we had one concert last night down at Chautauqua, we'll be having another concert tomorrow night at 8 o'clock right here, so please come. But we'll be doing discussions and lectures and workshops and master classes. And tonight we're going to have a discussion specifically about our guests' culture and history and background. And so without further ado, because I don't want to be talking too long, I want to introduce you to the Sorel visiting artist, the composer Chen Yi. And so, first off, we'll probably need all the mics on, so because you never know when we're going to, anybody will have a follow-up question. But Chen Yi, to start off, if you could just give us a bit of background in terms of where you're from, what was it like growing up, both as just a person and also an artist, and then what brought you to the States, and then my colleagues have some questions as well.
Thank you. First of all, I would say I'm grateful for University of Fredonia who gave me this substantial honor. I thought that the Sorel visiting artist program is really supportive, particularly for women composers and women musicians and new music, and also for the culture. Particularly, I know of this organization for a long time. When I was reached by Julie and Rob, I was very happy to be invited here. I thought that today I met so many students, and yesterday and the day before, I met all these excellent professors who play in my chamber concert. I thought that I was deeply touched. I thought that I was brought to the US when I studied at Columbia University in 1986, before you were born. But I was born in China originally in the 50s, last century. And in Guangzhou, which is near Hong Kong, and so I speak Cantonese as well. So many early immigrants to the States are Cantonese. You could see them in Chinatown, but now they move away because their children are educated and they went out from the city. But I was educated as also a musician because my parents both are classical music lovers, and they love music so much, and they expected all kids would learn music first. So I started playing piano when I was 3, and then I started violin training when I was 4, so I actually have gone through all this Western repertoire. If you name all the actors, we share all this everyday practice. Without an hour practicing, you are not going to allow to go out to play for fun or to go to park. And so that was a happy life in my youth time until teenager Cultural Revolution. When I was 15, I became a farmer, like a hard labor work. And you can imagine how many 50 pounds in the back. Maybe sometimes the load is heavier than my body. For that I have to carry all these muds and rocks to the top of the mountains, 22 times a day sometimes. And to build the military watchtower on top of those high mountains. And that kind of life lasted 2 years for me. And still I brought my violin with me, so I could find the spare time occasionally, right? The revolutionary songs are the only thing allowed to play. So that began my composition, improvisational composition career started from there. Because I play all these tunes which other people could hum along and they wouldn't block me. And then I added all these passages that I learned from all these cadenzas from concertos and Paganini capriccios, and you can find all these double stops up and down, and between the sometimes between the phrases, or sometimes the double stops with the melodies. I thought that I didn't realize that those are the improvisational composition for the first step. But not until the end of the Cultural Revolution, when the higher education reopened in the country. By then I was already 25, too old, but I was accepted to study composition in Beijing Central Conservatory. We have accepted 32 composition majors, but when the country opened, 20,000 applicants to apply to the Central Conservatory because 10 years blocked, no school, not even elementary school open. So I always tell our young students, can you imagine 10 years no school for anybody? You couldn't imagine that kind of interruption for education. That is bizarre, it's terrible for the culture, for education. But before that, I became a concertmaster in Peking Opera Orchestra, because when I was taken back from the countryside, many of my colleagues and former classmates are still in countryside, work for 5 years, some of them 10 years, until the end of the Cultural Revolution. But because I played the violin, and they somehow, the revolutionary sample operas needed the orchestra members. And then I was taken back to the city. And when the professional musicians are considered deeply polluted with their mind, or with capitalism mind, so that's why they were not allowed to go back to the city to play. And then they took the younger generation, like me, as a student, to be professional musician. So that's why I became the concertmaster for the Opera House Orchestra for the next 8 years, from 17 years old to 25. And so when I applied to the conservatory, I had already had some written pieces in hand. And then I got accepted as the only one from my city, Canton, Guangzhou, to be in composition major. And then I studied in this 32 people class, which includes 6 classmates who are trained as ear training teachers. And the others are composition majors. And so we have 5 women composers. And so that's why also that motivated me to have more women to study composition. That is not the same as later, because now when I go back to teach, or I visited Taiwan and Singapore, or these places, all these conservatories would have 90% of composition students who are women. So that is a completely different picture. By then, I was the first woman to hold a master's degree from the Central Conservatory when I graduated in 1986. And so that was my education in China. And what I have to mention is that besides the Western study, which would include all these regular courses, like ear training, history, harmony, counterpoint analysis, or this orchestration, but also we have a full course of Chinese traditional music training, and that would include folk songs and instrumental works, like a traditional instrumental, and that includes the solo repertoire as well as the ensemble repertoire. And then you would go on to have musical storytelling as well as theater. And so that is a big combination in the education. And then after the school semesters, we went to countryside to collect folk songs every year. That was the training as well. I still remember ear training and piano is a very heavy load as a minor, as a required course, because I am a violinist, but violin doesn't count. In the States, it counts. If you play guitar well, you can skill your instrument test. But in China, you are not going to pass because only the piano requirement. In the 5-year undergrad program, 4 years requirement. In a master degree, 3 years, you have 2 years requirement on the piano. So it's helpful for me to handle multi-layers and to memorize all parts, because the piano teacher would give you at least 4 assignments during the winter, the summer vacation. When you came back, you are not allowed to play the equal temperament with 2 hands. You have to memorize each part, single line. You memorize, play back a single line first before you are allowed to play 2 hands for 4 parts. That kind of training, I thought that may be helpful. All our piano teachers urge us, like we are not majors, so we play Hindemith sonata, or the pictures. Wasowski.
Our piano faculty are down here taking notes. So get ready for it.
You did the same. yeah. So that year training too, 4 years requirement. I thought that is very helpful when I graduated with my master's degree. Held orchestra concert played by the National Symphony in Beijing. I came over to Columbia University to study for my DMA, and my mentors are Zhou Wenzhong, who is a great mentor in transcending cultures and all these languages in his unique music. And also my dissertation advisor is Marian Davidovsky. I studied with him for 5 years, and not only electronic music but orchestra writing. With my contractor for dissertation, I thought that 7 years of Columbia time, when I taught 5 years year training, I go through all this from senior to freshman, every course, like a year training, what you have to go through. I thought that it's very good for me to learn my American students. First, I learned all their names. I tell them all their names. and then we worked together really well. If I didn't scare them.
So we also have some other questions. Jessica, would you like to ask your question first?
Yeah.
I've always personally been interested in the role of native languages or languages that we speak and its role in how we perceive musical phrasing, inflection, particularly in Western classical music, which was what I grew up with. I was very lucky as a kid. I spoke German as a second language, but other than being handy, I didn't think it was going to help me much until I moved to Germany to study. And then I met different mentors from Berlin and from Vienna, and I realized as they spoke to me in their native languages, it clicked one day. It was like a light bulb moment for me that the way they phrased their sentences, from the choice of words to the way that they inflected, was so ingrained in the way they conceived of music and how we understood architecture and structure in music.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, I had a conversation once with Mario actually a few years ago, and I was wondering what happens when we speak something like Chinese, which has so many more inflections in all of the syllables.
Wow.
How does that affect maybe the way we listen to Western classical music growing up, and how that affects one as a composer?
Wow. Because Mario, he is my teacher, so we are very close. We share a lot, actually, in musical language itself. Although originally he composed many pieces atonally, and my Columbia training also atonally, and many pieces written in this way, which is different from what I had been educated before, because in China, the tonal education is very important, used to be. If you don't follow this rule seriously, you fail this exam, because the freshman composition exam is to take 1 day to write a 3-part form piece, which you might have the pedal tone, the preparation of dominant to go back to the recap. If you fail, you are not going to go on. And this kind of training is completely different in terms of language at Columbia. I thought the Columbia education is extremely inspiring for me, because all these seminars are not forces you to do this or to follow this language, but discussion between all graduate students. Each of them would bring in different cultures, and they share their writing at the table. Like each week, you bring in your paper and share with 2 more people, and they would write comment on your paper and submit it to professor. All this kind of sharing also assign subjects, mostly atonal though. By then it's graduate school already, so I thought that I learned the 12th tone pretty deeply at Columbia time. But I thought that my way to use a 12th tone is different from the pure series system, because I use that in Chinese reciting style. As I told you, I learned Chinese musical storytelling, which is half singing, half talking. And it's like a Schoenberg, right? Immediately I thought that I was so close to Schoenberg, because I could tell all the inflection. Like when you said the tones, I could tell right away. When I went to countryside to collect folk songs, I also notated everything the farmers sang, because they don't sing in pentatonic scale at all. Actually, they don't read. How can they know pentatonic style and scale? When I went to countryside, they send the head, who is the oldest as the leader of the village to sing for us when we collected folk song. He would sing like this, dress in black and cover the head and say, like this. This is a tritone. This is completely not anything related to pentatonic. So I was so inspired, right? I transcribed also like about 300 pieces we heard from the farmers. When we went back to Beijing, we had to turn in the dictation sheets to the school. So they published in a book what we have collected during the winter. And those were discovered by some PhD students in the States. When they did research, they tried to find out where is located those books. And they found it. And they even showed me one book, including the pieces we collected, obviously without our name, but with the class. It was my class when we did those. I thought that this we share a lot, because Mario knows the tones so well, even written into his instrumental works. You can see the articulations and all these kind of intervals. When he taught me, he would sing out like this, like a ooh, ooh, like this. When you went back home, you can write 3 times more. Today I told you, he did that. And so I thought that I could do the same, because I could inspire my students to run home to write 3 times more as well, because he has the passion. He has learned the language into his heart, and he could reflect this into his writing. And actually, he taught me also a lot of technique, like orchestration technique. He would write on the paper, like these gestures, this kind of examples, not specific pictures, but the gestures. That is also different from Professor Zhou and Zhong. And he taught me how to go deeply into the pitches, to be in the system that he invented. He didn't teach me his system, but he taught me how to construct a system and how to be inspired by Chinese culture. For example, the choreography, which is like a double lines. You are not going to one line because the brush is thick. You can have a very light ink. You also could have a very dark, strong ink. Then you could have different colors, layers. And that became his counterpoint. And that also inspires me to compose many other pieces with different structures, different instrumentations, and also different technique, because we write for different instruments. He wrote for Western instruments. I wrote for some combined instrumentation, like including Chinese traditional instruments, which I learned from playing in the Peking Opera Orchestra, because we have about 7 people playing traditional instruments, plus the 4 major percussion instruments in Peking Opera. They have a particular fixed patterns to follow to show the actors and actresses how this emotion would go, how this position would form, and how these steps could walk by listening to their beating or their percussion patterns. And so that kind of education, I thought that is a full combination for me to be taken to New York. But New York's education gave for me more thought and thinking, because being in a multicultural melting pot, you can see that you hear the raps so popularly. So I took all these elements into my music as well. When you heard my 3rd symphony, for example, I took the rap elements into as the motivic material to develop. So that is my later development after I came.
Excellent. Michael?
Yeah, is it actually okay if I sneak in a follow-up?
Sneak away.
Questions before I do mine?
There are no rules.
Okay, since you're talking a lot about your training, and as someone who's in musicology, not music theory composition, but closely related, there are certain stereotypes that we have about music theory and analysis and how closely tied that is to teaching someone composition. And the stereotype is generally, and you even mentioned this to me over there when you talked about musicologists handling your work, an obsession with pitch structure at the expense of almost everything else, right? So, you know, at the expense of timbre, rhythm, articulation. These are things that theory, you know, peace to Gordon Root out there. Theory is notoriously not very good at teaching or discussing compared to pitch structure. Was that a problem when you came to Columbia? Is it something that's changed? You're also a composition teacher, so has theory, I'm not sure what I'm asking. Is it harder to learn timbre, orchestration, articulation as a composition student because harmony and pitch structure is so valued over everything else in analysis?
Actually, nowadays, many analysis papers not only focus on pitch dominating, but also many other elements. For example, I just mentioned the fixed patterns. Those are taken from folk music, right? And particularly when you learn Messiaen, for example, and Gamila, for example, all these are taken from folk culture, and also Stravinsky. If you talk about the Russian folk dance, although he denied, it is still the truth that you can compare back to back, and what you have learned from traditional culture, folk culture, and what you invented, and we are in between. So if we invented something inspired by the folk culture, it would become a new system, right? And so we may not have to follow what Etondo invention, what they did, but this is absolutely an inspiration, I would say, Schoenberg, because he did that, he opened up, and then you have Debussy with the tritone, and then you open up, what this we value. If without knowing this, how can you say invention? I would say that they are very inspiring. So I really treasure those courses I learned from both Central Conservatory and Columbia University. I thought that they are very helpful for my development to find my own voice, because all my atonal pieces are using Peking opera reciting style. When we recite old poem, ancient poem, how do I fit into this system, and also how do they sound exactly like a Peking opera? Because I came from Peking opera culture, where I played concertmaster for 8 years. I know the fingering really well of the Peking opera fiddle, right? I know this percussion because I heard this every day, and it's like this, earshot, very loud. And we learn all this language, I would say, and the style. So these are all the combination, as when you speak out naturally, the background will become the shape of your language. Maybe that's why I don't agree with these people to say, this is not good, crack down, this should stop. I don't think so. These are very good treasure for us to trace back, to learn. At least you have to know. Without knowing all these systems, you would think, oh, this is my invention. Actually, it's not. Somebody else have done it. And they did that very well. It's not my invention, not your invention. So study is very important. If you ask me, I really treasure those research and those papers written, because they really summarize what the good pieces did, what the people thought. Those are very inspiring. In New York, for example, when I went to Carnegie Hall to listen to American composers orchestra concerts, you always not only listen to the song, you read the program book, and you read other composers, how great they think. It's very inspiring. They took different directions, different cultural backgrounds, right? And they had different systems for us to learn. So it's more than classroom learning.
So since you mentioned that, okay, this is great. This gets me right into hold on, to my question, right? Which is, I don't know, there's a built-in easy answer for you here to this question, which is just no. I'm glad anyone plays my music, but I'm hoping that won't be the answer. But you mentioned program notes, reading programs, right? And you have reached a level of renown, let's say, where there's a lot of writing about your music. Both scholarly books and dissertations have been written on it, and a lot of writing also for the general public. Program notes, artist biographies, newspaper articles. And one very quickly notices that the first thing that they all say, in fact, the first thing that ours says, Dr. Chen Yi transcends musical and cultural boundaries. It is like a tattoo that they've put on you, right? In the way that, you know, when you think of Beethoven for a general audience, sometimes we reduce him to a stereotype. He's the angry revolutionary, right? Mozart is the drunken child savant. Mahler is the hypochondriac spiritualist, death-obsessed hypochondriac, right? And I often wonder, when writers and composers get to the level where enough people are talking about their music that they're trying to make it easily accessible, do you worry that they're reducing it to just that one thing, and that there's a lot of other stuff that audiences aren't being asked to listen for because they're told, oh, East-West, let me do my checklist. That instrument was from the East, that melody was from the West, and you know, the critics are kind of saying this is what she does. Do you worry that that lets us off the hook for hearing other stuff?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I have never thought of that.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I didn't want to add stress here.
Yeah, because that could be ideal if I could do that. It's great to combine using my music, which you could combine well, and also combine naturally, like a hybrid, but not artificially. And so it's my ideal thinking if I thought that my music would be. And also that is my practice. I have been doing this for many years. I want to bring the cultures together, and if not really together, at least you can share with others. Because when people didn't know each other, they may not understand each other well. But if they listen to other parts more, they could have this combination or understanding much closer. And so that is ideal. Maybe that's why it's written like this. This label was not given by me. It could be because so many labels in different organizations, it would need something guidance to guide audience or to guide general. I thought that this is a good idea to bring people together with my music. But you see, when you keep writing, you may have different subjects. Also, we may have something cross-culture, cross-boundary. I think that I didn't do enough. I didn't accomplish a lot. I only, if you say I am a beginner, I didn't do a lot of how do I say, multimedia, or I only did Chinese Miss Cantata with orchestra and choir, Chen Yi, and dancers and projections in San Francisco when I did my whole evening concert. When I finished my residency with the Women's Philharmonic and Chanticleer, then I invited the Chinese instrumental soloist and also the dancers to combine as this culmination concert, like the final report after the residency and before I became a professor in Peabody Conservatory. And so all these things that I thought that I have done not enough. And I wish I could do more, so I teach hard. I wish many students in our next generation with our experience, they could do much more, because the world needs you, needs the culture, needs our next generation to bring the peace, to bring the understanding with all this multicultural combination to the world. So I always
do everything.
Yeah,
and do it well.
Yeah, I don't do enough.
Oh no, don't say that. Don't say that. That's your advice for everyone. Be as open-minded as possible.
Yeah. For next generation, that is really promising. As what I said yesterday, also we saw the young composers who did so well, particularly in recent 10 years. All these competitions open up, right? You can see from those competitions how great they are. They reach the high level of everything. Not only one side or one culture or one technique, but the combination of the styles and the technique. And I think that is very hopeful for the future.
Excellent. Angela, your first question.
Yeah, actually my question is related to and resonate with Dr. Morgan's question in terms of crossing cultural boundaries and cultural connections in your composition. So I would like to know, how do you see your cultural identity and how this identity comes through in your composition? We know that you studied and worked in both China and the United States.
Yeah.
And in China, you were raised in this age of very intense communist-oriented education and training. And then later you moved to the United States. You were immersed in totally different philosophical, musical philosophical, and political ideology. So how do you negotiate your identity? And as a result, is there any kind of self-awareness in your own culture and music creation?
Yeah, actually my language and music language roots is Chinese, because I grew up with a mother's tongue, like a mother tongue. You can speak mother tongue well, better than other people who are not native in your language, I'm sure. So I would encourage my Chinese students, you have to learn how to speak Chinese first. If you don't speak Chinese well, you cannot even argue with anybody with a clear expression, because the language is so important for you. So if your mother tongue is not Chinese, then it's another story, because you may have to learn your native tongue culture very well first, and before you do everything else. That is my philosophy, I think. But in my case, musical training, I learned Western classical music first. But later on, I studied so deeply for Chinese traditional music. So in my composition language is rooted in Chinese music. When I found out, oh, this is my native tongue, and I could speak Chinese so well, and then I could read all these papers and novels and classics so well, and then I could dig into it deeply. But not until I combine these two naturally, I would say not artificially, then I cannot speak with my voice. That is your question. If, for example, I have many American students who also write for Chinese instruments, right? And some of them could write very, very deeply, naturally, because they learn the language. And not even the spoken language, but the musical language you can learn from repertoire, right? Fingering, all this deep study, right? And philosophy also behind, right? And then you can combine with your Western training. But if you talk about the later development, because I came to the States a long time ago, and so I do enjoy and appreciate all these cultural references, particularly when I went to San Francisco to work as a resident composer for 3 years, right? And I learned all this African drumming, African dancing. It's mixed performances with Chinese dancing groups in San Francisco. And I wrote for them and to bring all this for the Women's Philharmonic in my orchestra pieces. And so those are the combinations that I developed later, like the rap. Because when I went to Singapore to record my orchestra album by the Singapore Symphony, I went out to Tower Record, the shop. I found the first winning rap Grammy. That is the Wuha, right? And Buster. I got that album. I got this particular interval. Actually, is the motivic material for one of my movements of my third symphony. And then I developed that. My students, when they heard this, they laughed so hard. Although it's not singing piece, it's an orchestra piece. They still can identify the element because it's so common, the language is so close to their heart and for everyday listening. So that kind of culture combination, I thought influenced me a lot in my composition. Particularly when you walk in New York, you can hear this a lot, right? And in subway, I spent 8 years studying at Columbia. I could hear this steel drum in the subway. I forgot to go home. Very hungry, I stood there, just listen. I said, oh, these saxophone players are better than the studio musicians in China. The saxophone, and so I will stand there just to watch. And I thought that I enjoyed the culture so much. So I absorbed these kind of languages. I thought that it's very creative and inspiring. And so they are all in my composition, actually. If you ask.
Rob, can I slip in a follow-up question?
I'm guessing you're going to do it anyway.
So, well, you're talking about musical symbols, right, that are native to your world and how powerful they are. When I listen to your music, one question I always have, it comes up in almost every piece, is, okay, there are a lot of sounds that are immediately resonant with different groups of people in different ways, right? For instance, if Brahms uses a natural horn, he knows that his German audience thinks of the Rhine Valley and pastorals and, you know, hunters in the dark forest, right? All of this Germanic stuff. And so I wonder, when you use a specifically marked sound, like something like a pipa or something, for an American audience is listening, my assumption is that the connotations of that sound for that audience is distance, something exotic, something from far away. But if you play the same piece for a Chinese audience and they hear that sound, they have maybe the opposite reaction. They're hearing something that's close to home, that's nearby, that's not exotic, that's everyday. Is that something that you just have to live with? Or is it something that's part of the design?
Yeah, the composers may not know, because for the composers who heard, for the audience who heard Brahms, what he did, they might have read the stories and the culture in history book and music appreciation book when they took this class, and for particularly for music students. But if for Chinese people, without knowing this Western culture and no background, when they heard this music, they might just enjoy that as music itself. You should allow many layers of appreciation. That is a question of aesthetics and for the creation.
So you can't get too uptight about controlling the meaning. You just have to kind of let it go.
Right, because when a piece is born and it flies away from you, and particularly when audience are from different backgrounds, they would have different understandings even. And if you mention the instruments itself, they may have a kind of a symbol, iconic kind of meaning, but the music itself to talk about maybe literature or whatever, that could have a different context, I think. For me too, if I use a specific instrument, it might have a meaning, but it may not be specific.
Okay, so it's funny because musicologists will often obsess over the composer's intentions, right?
Oh.
And so often when you talk to composers, they're a lot more flexible with their intentions, and they'll say, well, let the performer figure it out, or let the audience figure it out.
Yeah, many of my pieces have a very clear aim, but I would allow different appreciation and levels of understanding as well, because they have their own mood, and you cannot control their mood, and also they have a different language, so they would appreciate with a different way. So I thought that composers may not know that much like you. Because you research, you do this study, so you may know more about different types of appreciation.
Can I resonate on Dr. Martin's question? So speaking of music understandings, I remember there is a French philosopher called Baudelaire, I can't pronounce his name, but his idea is, so this master, the artist has this capital, presents this capital, and then the culture capital, and then they present this culture capital in this the artwork, and the listeners has to decode this the piece. If they share the same cultural background, then they can understand immediately. So it's just I was there for the last concert, yesterday concert, and actually when I listened to all the pieces, they were great, by the way. And when I listened to them, I immediately, I could tell where those cultural roots, Chinese cultural roots, or from where those cultural roots are. Because when I listened to this viola performance, I heard, although it's a string, it's for viola, but I heard this almost like a folk tune, folk song. Sounds like somebody was singing, and I almost heard, I could hear this, and the tune for the Chinese Mandarin. And then we spoke after the performance, and you told me the stories about how you wrote this piece.
Yeah, because we have the same native tongue.
Yeah, right.
So you can hear the tunes from where. Even as a Chinese, you can tell the folk songs from which province, from which minority groups, because you are educated, you memorize all these songs in the conservatory. So you wrote paper about all these pieces. So you knew the material, you knew the style. So you can tell, even though I wrote my own original piece without quoting folk songs, you can tell that is the style from that region. And that is great because we share the same form. But many people may not know those regional or local culture. So they may appreciate that as general, like they would say, oh, Tono, or Hollywood. This is in Hollywood style. If you write in 19th century harmonic progression, they would say Hollywood right away. And they don't say, oh, this is a Chinese folk tune, because they don't recognize. And that happens always for many years in the States. Although we knew those tunes, because they fit into harmonic progression, which is a tonal language. So it became another style, actually. Particularly when you give a counterpoint, specific standard counterpoint, it will become Western music, I would say.
Before we ask to see if there's any questions out here, Jess, do you have another question to ask?
No, I guess I was just, it's not so much a question, I was just thinking about what Captain Markham was saying. And I think there are different layers too, right? The composer's intentions. I think the role of a performer is slightly different than what the expectations for a listener are too. The understanding and the dedication to try to bring out what the composer is meaning is a lot more important, I guess, for the performer, I guess in my opinion. And it's a little bit more come what may of what every individual experience is from the audience member. So I can relate to the part of obsessing over what a composer's intentions are, because I do think that that's incredibly important. And I have noticed that every time I work with a living composer, there's a lot more flexibility than when I have to sleep and ask the composer in my dreams what their intentions are. But yeah, I think there can be both at the same time. And it's, for me, I guess it's interesting, while I am Chinese and I speak Cantonese, I didn't grow up speaking Chinese as my native language. I can kind of order food at the restaurant.
Cantonese,
yes,
me.
But so I'm not as steeped in that culture in that way, and yet I do have elements of it. I mean, I feel like I'm probably a big product of kind of cross-cultural
hybrid.
Yeah, like there are certain traditions that I took, and my teachers were colleagues.
Yeah, Chinese. Your teacher is a Chinese Canadian.
Yeah, but yet I grew up speaking English, weirdly speaking French.
We share the same second language.
But
German.
yeah, and German and
second foreign language requirement.
I can say some cuss words in Mandarin. But that's only because my wife speaks Mandarin and she says them at me. Eventually figured out what she was saying. I bought a book and I figured it out.
It's really impressive.
So I wanted to make sure that we get a couple minutes at least for questions from the audience. And if you don't mind, when you raise your hand, ask your question, and then I will have to repeat your question because we're live streaming this, and so we want to make sure that folks hear it. So,
Dr. Dean, we have lots of time.
Oh, we have lots of
We have
time.
a good another 20, 25 minutes. Chat away.
Then, bring it. Yes, Lily.
Hi, Professor Chen. 你好. I'm from Guangzhou. My first language also Cantonese.
Cantonese.
Yes, I came here before I was serving, and I want to play one of your pieces from your composition because I found, oh, that's my language. I didn't know you were from Canton. And my question is, I grew up with, when we grew up, we sing Cantonese opera as our daily activity. So did you do that also? And do you have some influence, some Cantonese opera
was going to say, if you want to answer her first in Cantonese. And
Yeah,
then we
that is amazing.
But she was asking about incorporating Cantonese music and
Yeah,
specifically
you
Cantonese
remember
opera.
tomorrow night you would hear Professor David Rose. He would play one of my violin solo pieces, and this piece is called Memory, because my violin teacher passed away 10 years ago, and right after I heard this news, I wrote that piece, Memory, for violin solo, because we spoke the same language, right, Cantonese, and he is Professor Lin Yaoji, Lam Yu-Ge, and we call him Teacher Lin, and he was also a teacher of your teacher. Zhang Yunzhang is your teacher. And Professor Lin, when I call him, is Lin Lao Shi, right? In Cantonese, is Lam Lo Xi. And this is the motivic material in this piece, specific violin solo piece. Di, 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 right? So, la, re, fa, mi. And then I develop di, 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 o. And then weeping, right? Still the same material. And then I change it to different levels, covering the whole register, like a whole range of the violin. You can have this same tune playing on different registers and with different expressions. And some are very deep, some are crying, some are very high, until that reaches the highest pitch. It goes down, crying down, with a tremolo, like a larger interval of trio. It's a tremolo down, glissando. And so that is my mind to develop from my native language. If I could take something as the seed, as the element, then I develop. I have done this for many other pieces, but this is particularly Cantonese. You mentioned, although I didn't use theater or yudke to be the inspiration in this piece, because this is a solo piece, small, and when you talk about theater, that would deal with a whole structure. We were trained that way too, because when we learned theater in one of the required courses in China, back in the Central Conservatory, we learned the traditional theater arias, how they line up with this structure, particularly in your school, and you learn this aria with the singers, how many meters, different change, and also tempo change, right? Because it deals with the structure of that particular song, and that is called aria, like in the Western opera. And so we learn those, and in the final exam, we have to compose in this style, specific style, because every semester you have learn from different regions, and they have different structures, like when you learn. And she graduated from the Chinese
the
theater.
National Academy of
Theater, yeah,
So
Chinese theater. And so I have a colleague who teaches composition there. And that is a different language, completely different from Western. And they teach her how to compose following the Chinese structure of traditional theater. And so all these, and the tunes, because they play Chinese traditional instruments, they don't train Western instruments at all. And so this is a very good question. You came up with all this deeper study in the culture.
Yeah, I think we should all take a moment just to kind of acknowledge how beautiful an idea that is, composing. We have this thing in the West where we can compose people's names into a piece, but we have to assign pitches to letter names, and it's not very organic, right? You can make Bach into B, A, C, B flat, whatever. But the idea that in Cantonese you can compose the melody of a person's name into a piece, and it's like they're there.
Yes,
It's really beautiful.
we have 9 tones. Cantonese, 9 pitches. When you speak, we can sing instead of you are speaking, and then they would know what I mean. When the primary school didn't allow students to chat during the classroom teaching, right? They sing to each other with the letter names of Do, Re, Mi, Fa, So, and then they could know what mean you ask, what question, because speaking is not allowed, but they didn't say that singing is not allowed. The Mandarin has 4 tones, and so it's easier to learn. We speak Mandarin to each other in school, but we speak Cantonese could be at home, and then we speak Cantonese all the time in the city, not here.
Other questions?
So going off of what Dr. Markham was talking about with intention, how does wanting to allow a performer or a listener to develop their own interpretations affect the way you name a piece or a movement?
When we name a specific piece, I mean the freedom of interpretation, I thought that is when the piece was born. After that was born, it flies away. You don't control, you don't know, unless you give me a CD and ask me for comment. I may give suggestions. It's only suggestions, not to force you to change, because the music actually is abstract, I would say. For me, my music is not like that kind of forceful for you to take this way. Although all soloists, they would talk to me before they did the solo, most of them. Because those pieces are written, commissioned by these orchestras, written for specific performers, right? And they knew me, and so they would ask me about the interpretation, like what Jessica said. But not everybody, because they may not know the composer. And so that will go to whatever you want. Because I don't write a lot of aleatoric things, I wrote everything precisely. And although in the frames you can do improvisation, but the materials are given. And so you follow this instruction, you do your improvisation, and still it couldn't go too far away. If I don't want you to line up, for example, many parts I don't want you to play together, I would write out all the details in order for you not to be synchronized. It is a harder part for us, because we have to spend 8 hours on one page in order to do that, for you not to line up. But improvisationally, you can just write out a box. You can do whatever you want if you don't want them to be precise.
Is it hard to get modern performers to loosen up from what's exactly written on the page rhythmically, maybe?
And for certain musicians, this is the hardest job, because they are trained that way. They couldn't get rid of it. When you ask them to do improvisation, they immediately got stuck. Although they are winners, they play really well, virtuoso. They couldn't do improvisation because they don't have that sense, not that mind, not the inspiration. I thought that when you, Rob told me, you guys take the improvisation course, that is the most inspiring, to let them compose, to come out, to create. And that is the step maybe for their composition major. You can have more composition majors very soon. And so that is the way we train both. Because Gaudiamo's competition also has improvisation. Oh, ARD maybe. And these are virtuoso type of competition for performers, but they also have this kind of subjects.
Now, Andrew's question also brought up the idea of titles and what you call your pieces. When in the process do you actually come up with the title? Do you come up with the title before you write the piece, then you write the piece based on what the title is, or have you written the piece and then come up with its name?
This is also a very good question. You ask all technical questions. Usually I came up with an image first. And the image could be abstract and could be very precise. But I would have the image first because it brings you passion first. It brings you the excitement. Today I told you, if without this excitement you are not going to compose, not for deadline, not for homework, but you should have something to say, then you say, not because of the requirement. So that's why I would come up with the music image first. And sometimes that could be inspired by literature. For example, ancient poems or picture or whatever that could inspire you, maybe mathematics or diagrams, shapes. And for one of my orchestra pieces called Momentum, and because my dad took me to documentary, scientific documentary when I was a kid, and I saw the lava, the fire mountain, and when it broke, like this tension, like this hold on, like just one flag, then it broke, like this kind of tension, scared me, right, when I was a kid. And then I remember that one day I should have this expression, and not until I am very old, I composed a piece called Momentum, inspired by that documentary. The scene, scientific, actually it's the nature that inspired me for that piece. In that piece also a lyrical section with picking opera style of melody. But it was not quoting from any traditional opera, but in that style. And so it is a combination. I also brought out the piccolo and the percussion in the beginning because that piece was written for Peabody Symphony, and our professor, Terry Morai, he told me, we have accepted 3 excellent piccolo players. They fight for the solo part. They want to have something feature, and then I should make sure I have a piccolo solo. It became the beginning of my piece, of the orchestra piece. When you see my PPT, you could have the link, the Spotify link would have that piece. I thought the Spotify is free, like a playing CDs. So that is the piece. If you want to see the score, you can ask me, or you can see the Field of Pleasure, their website. They hang all these composers' scores there. Although you cannot print, you can flip pages.
Okay.
If you want to print, you ask me.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
This is kind of going off of the music talk. I wanted to ask you, because you've had the opportunity to study in both China and here in America, and you obviously have grown successful because of your opportunities, and I think for a lot of students here in Fredonia, most of the people here are from New York, and even in their further studies, they typically stay in New York. For you who have come a very far ways going from China to Colombia and staying in America to your students to have the experience of kind of getting uncomfortable and going somewhere that seems kind of, I don't want to say exotic, but it's kind of like out of your element? Do you think that is important?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
And for those of you who are looking, the question is the idea, or watching on the live stream. The question is, what are the benefits for students traveling and getting out of their element and basically going somewhere where they may not be as comfortable as they might be at home?
Wow. For me, it was no choice because when I was taken back from countryside as a farmer, I went to Beijing to study, right? And that was lucky because 20,000 Africans, you got accepted, so you left home, you went. And then when I went to Colombia, because that year China had not had master degree offer. And so I asked my teacher, I left because I got a master, but they didn't offer DMA. Now they have a DMA, so maybe they have more choices. They may stay there for their DMA. But my time, I didn't have any Chinese DMA program available. So I go further to study, I left. And so I also listened to Professor Zhou Zhong's record when he donated a lot of American composers' records of their works to China, like different conservatories, including the Central Conservatory. I could listen to those records, and it opens up, actually. I wanted to study with him, and I applied to Columbia University. I left. And when I finished, I got this support from MIDI composer, and I became a resident composer of the Women's Philharmonic and Chanticleer in San Francisco. That's why I went out to work. In these 3 years, I learned American culture more and deeply because I went to middle schools. I brought Chanticleer to 11 public middle schools. I worked with all of them. I taught even composition to the like a teenager or younger. And then Chanticleer would sing with middle school students back to back on stage. And I recommended Palo Alto High School choir to sing together with Chanticleer. It's on CBS. It's a Sunday morning.
Oh yeah, CBS Sunday morning.
CBS, and to sing my works and many other works. We went to education programs. Also, I learned so much American cultures and also the language because the kids sing jazz and they are educated by their teachers, right? They would come down, hold to the softest, and then make noise to the loudest. And that inspires me so much. I wrote all of this into my music. And also, when my music was playing in New York, these kids in the education program, after the piece ended, they shouted so loud, like almost the roof will be broken, like this loud and high. Crying. Like this kind of excitement would inspire me. I thought that I traveled to these different places. I thought that they are my homes. I didn't think I left home. So that would be the personality that could help. And some people, maybe they stick in one place, but many of my students travel a lot. For example, the master students, they apply to Europe, and they apply for different grants, even in summer. Everywhere they went to summer workshops to Europe a lot, and some went to China. And they are not Chinese, but they learn those instrumentations and workshops. And when I went to Taiwan to teach workshops, I saw my former American students there as well. I didn't tell him to go, but you can see this. They wanted to know the war. more. So we don't need to push them because the young people are so active, they know everything. And they teach me, actually, everything, every day.
Other questions? I'm sure you can come up with a couple more. Okay, now we got 5 of them. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. You first. Yep, you.
So I think you might have already answered this in one of the previous questions, but I'm wondering, so when you compose, I know you mentioned that you see like an image. Is that typically how you just start out from there and then develop it? Or what's your method to starting a composition?
And what happens when you're first? I'll go slow so you can drink. So when you're first getting the idea of a composition, or if someone comes to you with a commission and inspires the idea of a commission, a composition, what happens at the beginning?
Wow, this is a specific, right? And usually instrumentation would go first because the commissioner would ask for writing for my group or my orchestra, right? So that means the instrumentation is given. Although the instrumentation may be flexible. For example, if a Cleveland orchestra comes and they would give you, this is an available list. They have a portable wind orchestra, but they have more than portable wind. And then I thought, most of my orchestra pieces are for triple wind orchestra, and some are double wind. So I did portable wind for Cleveland because it's available. And then some orchestras could do it like San Francisco or even St. Louis and Kansas City Symphony. They could do the same. So that's okay, although it's not so popular like the triple wind orchestra. But normally I would follow the instrumentation first, and then the next would come like what we said before, in image. Certain image would fit into this kind of instrumentation, but not everything. For example, if I said momentum, it may not fit in some solo instrument because it's unable to do it, or not ideal for that kind of effect. So I would think of image first, and then would fit into this instrumentation, and then the next would come with textures. I may use the pencil, you may use the computer to write down all these possible textures, right? Or patterns. You would say rhythmic patterns or pitch materials, whatever that could be related to. And that is the second thing. And then when you have more done, you may think of a structure. I told you today that I would write out the first page first, according to this image. And then I would think of the structure proportionally. And some pieces are written improvisationally. You got to write out one section and then the other follows. And then you may exchange the sections, like a writer to write your articles, but you may be more logical than we do. We could change more, and because the textures are not so logical sometimes. But for me, I would think of orchestration to be logical, important. It's like what we learned from Debussy, and he would have constructed all these sections intentionally, with all the sections symbolized by orchestration textures, like groupings, right? And so that could be a plan too, if you compose in this technique. If you read that book, Debussy's Roy Howard wrote a book, Debussy in Proportion. You know the book? the library has the book written by Roy Howard, Howat, and he talks about the structure, talks about how important the orchestration textures related to structure, and that also inspires us as a novel composer. Right. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, we've got time for one more. Sam?
Hello. I'm the one you keep bumping into around campus. I'm also a composer, and your music really inspired me because I'm also inspired by folk music, but I'm inspired by Puerto Rican folk music because that's what I grew up listening to. And sometimes I feel like a lot of my music is inspired by it, but sometimes I feel like I'm a little too on the nose, where people are like, okay, I get it, like you're Hispanic. But do you ever feel like that? And if you do, how do you balance out incorporating folk music into your music without being too like, do you know what I mean?
So for the folks who are listening on the stream, basically, Sam was asking, how do you incorporate music from one culture into another culture, specifically Western classical music, without being too, quote unquote, on the nose?
Quote unquote, on the nose. Because you could learn from Bartok, because he is a good example. He would classify his works into 3 categories influenced by folk music. And because one could be arrangements, like what we did for choral works, for folk songs, and like what he did, and even published many books of transcriptions. But the second category could be written in your original tunes, but inspired heavily by folk tunes. That is what I do in a lot of my work. But in my work, it's hard to draw the line between the second category and the third, because some of my works are a combination with this folk music influence, but original tunes, and the abstract part. The abstract part I would count even including fixed patterns, rhythmic patterns, or rhyme patterns. Those rhyme patterns belonging to classic literature, and the rhythmic patterns belong to folk music, right? And if you borrow these principles to write your music, it may be translated into pitches. And so that is already different, because the farmers don't understand you. They didn't know. And some educated farmer who play those folk music may identify that, oh, that is my music. They would identify. But they couldn't follow you because you added the pitches, right? That is my way too. That was what Stravinsky did that too. If you read all the articles.
Except he lied.
Right, except he didn't say that. We say that, what we learn. Yeah, and that's possible. But if you look up Syria, Roberto's music, he wrote for Evelyn Granny when she did the diamond for her instruments in different sets of instruments. He did the Puerto Rico style, right? You can hear from her playing, even half improvisational and half written. You can hear the style, and it's notated. And so he borrowed this folk style, and he could write them into his original music. And I thought that those are the good examples for us to learn from and to share. Also, many, if you look up this type, New Mexico, University of New Mexico, they have a competition dedicated to this type. because their former professor collected all these folk materials from local, like the region, and they put that into their library and to inspire people to write based on those materials, and then they submitted art music, like a concert music for competition, right? That competition is pretty influential. I mean, they have a symposium with research, and maybe you go to that kind of conferences or look up their website. It would give you a lot of inspiration for doing this. And this is a Western culture that was brought to New Mexico, different from Latino. But Latino has more because the layers of multiple parts of percussion sound with the rhythmic structures. A lot to learn. You translate them into pictures. You have the invention. Next time we will see your book. Because some published books would have the transcription. Like they wrote down what the musicians did. Although they didn't read, they played, right? You write that down. And then when you use this to compose, and we don't know, you teach us, then we would learn your culture. That's the way composers do.
So 3 quick things. First, can we thank Chen Yi? Second, I wanted to let you know that we have a reception right out here. So please not only partake, but also come and talk with Chen Yi. Trust me, growing up and not being able to, not often getting a chance to meet a really well-known composer, this is your chance to be able to connect with her for the first time, and then you can see her again when she comes back in February. Lastly, all of this that you've seen today and you'll see tomorrow evening, there were a bunch of folks who were involved in making sure that it happened, but I wanted to give a huge shout out to Julie Newell, who made sure that this whole residency went flawlessly, which it has. Julie. Thank you so much for coming.
Please stay in the lobby afterwards. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, don't miss this chance. This is the first time I ever met Chen Yi, and she